So DCED, some of you may recall that 20-something years ago, the DCED organized a string of conferences on business development services. At the time, those conferences were about management training, incubation, very much framed in terms of sustainability of service and not displacing local providers. So at the time that morphed into market systems development, but now we're revisiting the theme, and this time framed less in terms of sustainability and more in terms of impact and even proven impact. So this is a high bar. All of you will already know how hard it is to prove impact or prove anything very much in the world that we live in, let alone use the proof, use the evidence to inform our actual decisions on the ground. We'll be familiar with inertia and resistance to change that struggles to take evidence into account. So I'm particularly excited today to have Nicholas Koloff of the Argidius Foundation and a couple of his associates to tell us a little bit about their experiences and answer our questions. So we'll run for the full hour, and if you have a question, put it as in the Q&A box, and we will endeavor to get to all the questions at the end of the presentation and panel discussion. So first of all, let me hand over to Nicholas, who is Executive Director of the Argidius Foundation. Welcome, Nicholas. Over to you.
Super. Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here. Argidius is a private family foundation based in Switzerland, and we focus on the support of small and medium enterprises, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, but also have the work has global implications. And the objectives for this hour are to showcase the growing evidence about what does an effective enterprise support organization and intervention look like, to provide some examples of that work, and to show how that's generated and responded to evidence that if you get certain things right in the way in which those interventions are delivered, you will get significantly better impact when it comes to the growth of those businesses and their capacity to create employment and access funding. And also to explore how funders can increasingly incorporate these proven approaches in the work that they do. Next slide. That's our agenda. So 15 minutes, which is something of a challenge to present this evidence. So, but it's all available elsewhere on our website, and we'll give you the links to that going forward. We'll have a discussion between myself, Alice, who is directs enterprise support organization in Rwanda, and Julia, who works for Triple Jump and the Dutch Good Growth Fund, which is an investor and funder of this space. And be open to questions and hopefully answers with you all as we go along. Next slide. So why are we interested in small and medium enterprises? Well, primarily because they're the engines of employment growth, particularly formal employment. And here's a quote from most recent Nobel Prize winners, Banerjee and Duflo, around salaried wage jobs being the distinguishing feature of separating middle class from the poor in developing countries. So how do you create more formal jobs by supporting small and medium enterprises in their growth trajectories? Next. Of course, SMEs come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So we're talking today about those businesses that are from all stages, from idea through startup to growth. But the three subsections we're particularly interested in are those small group of micro enterprises that are entrepreneurially driven and go through a formalizing process and become small enterprises. Dynamic businesses, which are larger, better established businesses, perhaps with revenues of between $50,000 and $300,000 in an average country. Relatively slow growth, but very significant because they're a very significant portion of the market space, often family-owned businesses. And then finally, venture businesses, those businesses that, at least ideally, are going to be gazelles, have hockey stick kinds of growth and trajectory, start small, but end small, medium, and even in some cases, large. In terms of interventions, interventions come in many shapes and sizes, from forms of acceleration, business planning competitions, cohorts that pass through accelerators, business incubators. Things that broadly could be described as organizational development, things like management training, individual consulting to businesses, mentoring and coaching of entrepreneurs and their management teams, business networks where businesses come together to learn from each other. And access to finance, of course, can be split around institutions, around funds, and of course around financial advisory. Then there are platforms which often provide access to services, but also access to information, and of course, obviously, research into what works and doesn't work. And we've been interested as a foundation to work in a number of selected testbed countries and to see how this ecosystem of enterprise support develops over time. So 2 countries in Central America, Guatemala, now Colombia, Kenya and Uganda, East Africa have been our testbed countries to see the growth of services, both in terms of their scale, their coverage, often going beyond the capital cities where they usually start, but also their effectiveness and quality. We've built the capacity of impactful and cost-effective enterprise support organizations to deliver at scale, both nationally, regionally, and indeed globally. And we've promoted, hopefully, effective learning to concentrate resources on proven interventions. Next. So we've been doing this for about 8 years. We started out on this strategy to find out what worked, what didn't work. 8 years ago, for example, nobody knew whether a business accelerator would actually accelerate. Were business accelerators just good at choosing businesses that are already growing, doing things with them, and then seeing them continue to grow, but not actually knowing whether anything they'd done had actually contributed to that growth? So we decided to fund a range of organizations across the spaces that I've just described, organizations that appeared to us to be good, to measure the same things using 3 indicators: incremental revenue, full-time employment, ability to raise capital of the underlying businesses. 12,000 businesses shared their data with us. Many more participated in the programs we supported. Those programs represented about 100 separate projects within the 50 organizations, and that represents about 500 cohorts of business going through some form of intervention. And at the same time, we supported research to look at what worked and didn't work further afield. So we sponsored the GALI, the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative, which was run out of Emory University, which has looked at 100 accelerator programs globally. We scrutinized academic papers to find out what people were learning, and indeed, we even sponsored some academic papers. And we looked at learning initiatives, including evaluating most of our major programs quite closely. So this is what we began to find. So if you remember, we have our 3 levels of kinds of business profile, and we have our 3 buckets of intervention. And you can see there were green dots. There was strong impact with cost effectiveness. There were yellow dots, these programs that could do better. And there were red dots, which were christened by Graham Macmillan and now at the Visa Foundation as the WOWs, the why did we fund that, and why, for that matter, probably is the organization doing that work. But what you'll see in this distribution of color was that it didn't really appear to matter, what you called your intervention. It didn't even matter which kind of enterprise you were focusing on. You got impact if you were good, and you didn't if you were bad. But what was a separator between good and bad? Next. Well, we looked, as well as our own results. Here's some of the examples of the results of others. And as you can see, the ones in green suggested that business development support did indeed help businesses grow over time effectively and create revenue and employment. And the ones in red suggested that there was no reasonable or meaningful effect on business growth and development. So what were the disaggregators in this space between green and red? Next. Well, put it at its simplest, it's not what you do, it's how you do it. And since we worked in international development, we thought we'd better come up with a cunning acronym for our work, and we came up with SCALE. SCALE stands for select, charge, address, learn, and lead by example. So selection. Selection is important because you want to identify the right enterprise for the right kind of intervention that you're providing. And that selection generates good quality buy-in from the enterprise. So it's a mutual relationship. It's rather like how can you effectively date between the enterprise support organization and the enterprise itself. One of the ways of doing that was to look at multi-stage over the course of a program. So you'd have a kind of funnel effect. You'd start to work with dozens or hundreds of businesses. You might provide a relatively small, not very intense intervention, but you begin to identify who represents your segment. And that might be about entrepreneurial commitment. It might be about the age of business, the scale of business, the ambition of the entrepreneur. There are various different characteristics that determine good selection, but you yourself as an intervention have to be really clear about what kind of segment you're aiming for. And it helps enterprises to find themselves working together in enterprises that look like themselves, more or less, in terms of age, scale, size, and not necessarily sector. Next. Charge. A lot of business development services and interventions are free. The evidence suggests that free isn't really very helpful. Now, charging doesn't mean you have to cover the full economic cost of providing the support. That's probably unlikely because, after all, most particularly early stage and ideation interventions, even in developed countries, are subsidized as public goods or by the corporate sector or by philanthropy. But charging creates a relationship. It creates a relationship of commitment on behalf of the entrepreneur. They have skin in the game. They've paid for this. They have a set of expectations which are aligned with having paid for this. Therefore, their likelihood of turning up, being attentive, being committed, and demanding a good service from your business development intervention is much higher. And likewise, the enterprise support organization develops a more commercial, client-focused relationship with its intervention. So one of our interventions in Central America, this was one of the 2 changes they made to their program, charging for the first time. They got fewer applicants, but they got much better quality applicants, and they got much more committed applicants. Next. So this is probably the most important one. And at one level, it's really simple. Address problems. We learn best through problem solving. So what you do is you help your enterprise solve its current problem. Now, that might require you to develop the appropriate diagnostic and assessment of that problem. And then, having solved that problem, you enable the business to learn how not to have that problem again. In the jargon, it's called reverse curriculum because it's exactly the opposite of what you did at school. Most entrepreneurs or entrepreneurial teams are very busy and they're very challenge focused. Help them overcome a particular challenge and then they'll learn, say, for example, how to manage cash flow. But don't expect to teach them cash flow 1 year and expect them to use that knowledge the next year to solve the problem that emerges, which is to do with their cash flow. So that's very important, real-time problem solving. And the intensity and timing of delivery was also very important. And intensity matters. Sometimes your program can be not intense enough. So it doesn't make the kinds of learning demands and challenge demands that the entrepreneur or enterprise team responds to. Or it can be too intense. You're actually asking the entrepreneur to apply too much knowledge to solve their problems at any one particular time, and therefore nothing gets embedded fully. And finally, in this section, we learned that planning, which isn't having a business plan, but it's enabling the entrepreneur to manage how their model changes in relation to the changes in their market and their environment. And selling are fundamental topics. Selling, not necessarily marketing, the actual act of selling your product and service and what that actually means going forward. Interestingly, financial management is less important, which is something that consistently surprises people, because obviously businesses need to be managed intelligently financially, but it's not a critical factor in long-term success. Next. Yes, and this moves from the focus on the entrepreneur to the focus on the organization. So the enterprise support organization really does need to be able to evaluate its enterprise performance and those results. It needs appropriate monitoring and evaluation systems. It needs to be curious about what works and doesn't work. It needs to be interested both in the qualitative changes that an enterprise undergoes in behaviors and practice of the enterprise, but also quantitative on how their revenue changes, how they manage their cash more effectively, how they employ people, how they get access to finance. And that has to be highly relational. In a sense, you get much better data if you're friends with the people you work with and you have a relationship over time, which is based on trust. And that is a good indicator, again, of an effective enterprise support organization. Next. And as an organization, you need to be able to lead by example. You need to be able to improve your own organization to better serve enterprises. You yourself need an ability to plan. You also need to have a well-organized, empowered, and capable team. And you need limited defendable staff turnover. You yourself need a strategy, and also you need governance. One of the things that was noted in the governance of enterprise support organizations is often they don't have serious, successful entrepreneurs, i.e. people who've done this before, on their boards of governance. And therefore, there's a whole piece missing around the quality journey that an entrepreneur might face. And of course, it places an onus on funders to think about how their funding goes to strengthen the quality of the organization, not simply the quality of the program. We would notice across our portfolio, we have a number of organizations that prove to be really good at the programmatic, helping entrepreneurs learn, solve their problems over time, but actually are fairly weak when it comes to their own structures and their own governance. Now, this is partly because many enterprise support organizations are rather like the enterprises they support. They're relatively young, they're relatively inexperienced. It's a growing and developing sector. Next. So simple changes in relation to scale have led to improved enterprise performance. So once we developed scale, we took it initially to our own portfolio of partners and invited them to use it as a lens to explore certain things they may wish to change in relation to their program. And here's just one example, B-Piece. As I mentioned earlier, they introduced a fee for their clients. They got fewer clients and they got better, more motivated clients. They had improved the quality of their selection and they improved the quality of the commitment of the client to the program. And they also adjusted the timing and intensity of the delivery to better address entrepreneurs' problems. Again, their program was actually too intense. They were requiring entrepreneurs to take 2 quality improvement projects and run them simultaneously, virtually. And that was too much. Much better to help the entrepreneur focus on what the current problem is, the current blockage in their business, and help them remove that, learn not to have it again, and go forward in that way. And the new cohort generated a 10 times incremental revenue increase, and it doubles job creation in half the time because the program was shorter and the program was cheaper to deliver because it was shorter, and they were also gaining a certain amount of income from the fees that they charged. So very simple changes, which might actually save you money, will make for an effective, more impactful program. And this is just one example of partners that have taken scale, looked at what they've done, changed 1 or 2 things, and began to get better, improved impact. Next. So scale has been compiled into a report. It's been published on our website. It's now available in 4 languages, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, as well as English. There's an executive summary. There's a diagnostic tool, both for funders to help them identify and assess, shape impactful partnerships with enterprise support organizations, and for enterprise support organizations themselves to self-assess and identify strengths and areas for improvement. There's a one-pager, which provides quick reference, and there's a reflection tool to help one think through what good practices would look like in relation to scale. And very importantly, to say again, scale is not a methodology. It is a series of evidence-based lenses to help people look at their program or the program they're funding, ask better questions, make incremental improvements, but significantly help enterprises to grow and change. Next. And here are some examples of scale being used by people around the world. So I'll just pick out a couple of examples. So the Honduran Ministry of Industry and Commerce is using scale to address quality issues in their network of 12 regional business support centers. The Ministry of Finance in Cambodia is building what they see as a flagship entrepreneurship program, and scale is its implementing principle. They're using it to help assess which ESOs will be granted resources to enable them to develop and grow. And in Ghana, the Global Steering Group for Impact Investing are using scale to develop standards and improve the quality of enterprise support sector in Ghana. Ghana also has a new enterprise development agency, and GSG are exploring with them the way in which scale might be relevant to the work as they implement it for the first time. So this is just scale again, by way of memory. I almost did that in 15 minutes. I'm sorry, it's a bit breathless, but again, we'll put the links in the chat and in the Q&A so that people can look at the documentation. It also includes 6 case studies of our partners and how they've used aspects of scale to develop and improve what they do over time. So that it gives you a real kind of texture. What are the organizational challenges of improving quality of performance going forward? So I should turn now, once I've grasped some water, to Alice and Julia, who could probably turn their cameras on. Ah, there you are. So I'm going to ask you really both the same question, but from obviously different perspectives. So Alice as an implementer of enterprise support, and Julia as a funder of, and how you perceive what the lessons of scale might mean for you, and how you've applied it in relation to the work that you do as implementers and funders. So over to you, Alice, first.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. And first of all, thank you for having me here today. It's a true pleasure. We have been working with entrepreneurs here in Rwanda for the past 10 years. And when the scale came out, it was a helpful tool to see, to put a name on what we have been doing, in fact, and recognizing what has been providing the success factors that we were seeing. Indeed, starting in Rwanda, at the beginning, we were really trying to help entrepreneurs until we understood that the selection is crucial to identify those that entrepreneurs that have the capacity and also the willingness to grow with us. And so over the years, the selection and the charging turned out to be extremely helpful at the beginning. And over the time, we introduced a strong coaching approach, with which we use to work with the entrepreneurs to understand where they are standing and what the problems are, so that they can find solutions themselves. And yes, and I would like to add at this position that we did this coaching initiative with the great support of Argedius. And this was a tipping point in the approach of BPN. And so as of now in Rwanda, I'm really proud to say that we are recognized as by the Ministry of Trade and Industry as the most impactful business development program due to the fact that you see a change in the entrepreneurs that we work with. On one side, the way they approach problems. In our countries, we are in countries where there are a lot of problems in different manners. And traditionally, we tend to focus on the problem and talk about the problem and so on. And these entrepreneurs have learned to not stay with the problem, but look at it from a different angle and solve it. And so this coaching approach has made a huge difference in the way these enterprises have grown, so that everybody who sees them recognizes that they are behaving differently than other entrepreneurs. And yes, and coming back to scale, I would say that today, our main focus is on the leading by example. So over the 10 years, this year we will be celebrating our 10th anniversary. And over the 10 years, we have grown to a level that we partnered with different organizations. And last year, we were in a position to double our efforts because the demand is so big here in Rwanda. And now we have been working on being able to lead by example. So we are going through the same process that enterprises go through when they are growing. And we are glad that we have a strong group of alumni association, which plays a very big part in this process of leading by example and growing the institution. Yes, so that's in a nutshell where we are today as BPN in Rwanda.
Thank you, Alice. Julia.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for having me and for us to share our experience. Definitely, for us, the select is the number one most important. It's about selecting and first segmenting and then selecting. We've seen it just brings focus. I saw a question in the chat as to how do you assess that when the companies are really early stage. You can already see it even with a company very early stage. I mean, the characteristic of whether this is more of a formalizing company or a high growth potential venture, you will see it from day one. I think that it's the business and then linking it also to the entrepreneur. We've gone through an exercise recently looking at our youth enterprise kind of portfolio and understanding, we speak about all these youth-led enterprises, but we just define them as having, an owner that is less than 35 years old. There's a lot, much more like diversity in that. So actually being able to segment again per entrepreneur and to select who are the ones that you can best support, we've seen is really a success factor. I will just put 2 or 3 things on the other ones because they're also important. Just on the charging, to echo a bit what you said, Nicolas, it's not about just putting a price tag like the fee. No, it's you can charge in so many different ways. It's about aligning the incentives basically. So you can also look into sharing a bit of the increase in turnover, for instance. It's very, very, very important, and we've seen that the ones who do it really see a big impact. And another one that I wanted to mention also is on the addressing really what the problem is. And it's really about what is the exact solution. So instead of, going through, I don't know, do you label yourself as an incubator, an accelerator, or that? What is it exactly that you are doing? What is it exactly the solution that you're providing for these enterprises to grow? And the last one is about the learning. Yeah, and I think that's maybe why, we don't see so much of that. Yeah, it does take a little bit of effort to think about, okay, what have we learned and how do we, use that into moving forward? But there are very simple manners of doing it. We've gone through it. I think that, getting your data into place is very important. And sometimes just having a proper Excel spreadsheet with your key indicators, even if they are only the 3 that you mentioned, Nicolas, then you can say whether it's working or not. And if you can learn from that, then you can adapt and you can get to better results.
Super. Yes, and I think that point about choosing your indicators carefully, not them necessarily being extractive, so they're things that businesses should and could want to understand, and being able to see whether your impact is across your portfolio, or whether it's being distorted by outliers, because you might hit one or two, or you might not hit. You might hit one or two home runs and then discover that the rest of the portfolio isn't actually moving, which suggests that actually your contribution is probably fairly minimal. But if you can see your whole portfolio and see that change over time, you begin to see, actually, we are having a meaningful effect across the spectrum of enterprises we're working with. So one question I noticed in the chat, which is a very powerful development question, which is, are we only selecting winners? So so when we talk about selection, we're obviously selecting businesses that have the opportunities to grow. But what's that, are we neglecting or narrowing the focus of our support? So how would you tackle that one, Alice? You're on mute.
Yes, that's a very good question. That's a very good question that we have also asked ourselves. And as I said before, that's also what we were doing at the beginning. We were like, those who have potential, they can help themselves. But in fact, it depends on what you have to offer. And the packages, our target is job creation. And you create as jobs when you support those who are in a position to create jobs and who want to do that. And there are different institutions. I believe that's why it's important that it's a big ecosystem. And each ecosystem, each player in the ecosystem have their target groups. So our target group is more of the dynamic companies, and because what the content that we provide, the coaching, the target, the vision, all that can only work for someone who has the same target. And there we have many other players here on the market who also support small, how did you call them, Nicholas, the first category?
Formalizing.
Before formalizing.
Necessity-driven, yes.
Necessity-driven businesses, exactly. There are different initiatives. And I believe even in that initiative, if that's your target group, you still have to select those that want and that are honest, that understand what you want to do with them. So I believe it's valid across the whole scope. Yep. Well, now that we are talking about selection, there's something I would like to add. In the selection process, there are stages. So at least the way we do it, and I believe it's also what the scale suggests. And we make sure that in this selection, at every stage, that the entrepreneurs benefit from that. So it's not just like we are screening you, you're good, you're not good, you're in or you're out. In every step, the entrepreneurs learn something, and we show them we value the effort that they are putting in what they're doing. But if we can see that the business they've had definitely not a chance to be sustained, or the product are totally not relevant, we will explain to the entrepreneurs why we see that. And so that we give the person the chance to go and work on it, even if it's not part of the program. And so I believe that part of valuing the entrepreneurs and valuing the effort, no matter whether they qualify or not, and using a staged approach is crucial, so that you can look at the enterprise and the person from different angles.
Yeah, and thank you. And Julia, there's another question about, and I know Dutch Good Growth Fund, of course, I've forgotten how many multiple countries you work in, but a question about, is this relevant in the context of fragile countries, or in countries where there are thinner markets than perhaps you'd find in somewhere like Kenya?
Yes, we can invest into and intervene in 70 countries. We are now exposed in close to 60. So yeah, we have a fair share of fragile states there. I would say that it still applies. I mean, the idea about the segmentation and the selection is not about picking only winners, but it's about setting basically the expectations. I mean, we're also speaking about entrepreneurship there, and I mean, we have to be realistic. We know that true entrepreneurs are only a very small percentage of any given population. So you have to select the right ones, the ones that will grow their business to where they want to grow them. I think it's really about being able to bring the added value. So even if you work in an ecosystem where maybe, you know, there are also markets where entrepreneurship is not celebrated, so you don't have that many to have there. It's not a matter of having a lot. It's a matter of being specific, targeted, because if you target, you are focused, and then what you bring is really added value. And so the impact on the business will be, yeah, much more positive.
And I just wanted to note, we looked at our own data for 2019, and we looked at the enterprises that our partners had supported, both in Kenya and Uganda. And those enterprises are responsible for creating a quarter of all the new formal jobs in those two countries. Now, that's too small a figure. As we know, there's a huge gap between formal job creation and informal job creation. But if you think that that enterprise support services were able to work with a sufficiently large scale of enterprises which enable them to grow to create that level of employment, then you're seeing something that's really interesting to the ecosystem as a whole and to the country as a whole, as it moves from low, hopefully, to middle income. So it's very important. But yeah, as you say, we are indeed focusing on enterprises, but as Alice said, segmenting and identifying which segment's important is also very important. Which also, I noticed another question which is about whether scale applies to entrepreneurs earlier in their development, where you're moving them perhaps from $2 a day to $10 a day. Well, a lot of the research, most recent research, is actually focused on resilience. So rather than teaching people specific business-related skills, they focused on the psychological and social skills it needs to build businesses effectively. And the research on that was an RCT in Togo, for example, and seems to be quite clear that actually, particularly at early stages and smaller businesses, yes, you focus on a different set of learnings, possibly, particularly on the person's own sort of behaviors, motivations, but you will have similar effects. And certainly the way in which the programs are constructed, bearing in mind how most people learn, i.e., you know, I have a particular challenge that I've noticed, I have a particular problem, can you help me solve that? And then adopt a set of skills not to have that problem again. That seems to work across the whole spectrum. But certainly it was true, and we started the strategy now 9 years ago. You know, there was a thought that you'd get most impact with a certain kind of business and a certain kind of intervention, and that proved to be completely untrue. As long as your interventions are structured in the way that we're describing, it really doesn't matter what level of enterprise you're working with, what stage it is, or indeed what you call yourself. As you, Julia, said, it doesn't really matter whether you call yourself an accelerator or a consultancy or a whatever. It's the way in which you do what you do that really matters. So I'm going to bring Jim in now, because I'm sure he has some interesting questions, or he may have noticed other interesting questions floating by in the question and answers, or indeed the chat.
Thank you, Nicholas and Alice and Julia. I think you've tackled the questions that were asked now, but let me please ask any more questions as a participant if you have any. Meanwhile, I'll paraphrase questions that were asked before the webinar itself. One of them is about wider context. The approach that you're describing seems quite focused on what some would call the micro, the individual businesses. What about the larger context, the larger companies that trade with small business, the governments that set the enabling environment? I mean, there's a lot of other factors in there that could be considered, or is this something else, someone else's job in your sort of view?
I'll have a go, and then perhaps Alice can have a go because she's on the Rwandan Development Board. So I think that there are certain things that in that description which really matter in relation to immediate individual business growth. So market access is very important, whether it's obviously a small and medium enterprise to a larger enterprise, crucially whether it's exporting. So there's a great RCT from Egypt which had carpet manufacturers, and the carpet manufacturers supplying the domestic market, or carpet manufacturers supplying the French market, and they were the two controls. And the exporters developed, businesses grew significantly faster than the domestic market, and that's partly because they were receiving technical support and challenged to provide a certain level of quality by the importing French companies, which of course the domestic suppliers didn't actually have. But certainly it's true that you can of course see this space grow into thinking about, well, what does the business support ecosystem look like? Who provides it? So in Francophone West Africa, for example, most countries have their own state-owned or state-related enterprise development organization. In East Africa, it's primarily private provision. So what's the right balance? Those kinds of questions, quite important. And also, yes, I mean, almost everything else, you know, finance access, taxation policy, you can put all of that in. I suppose the way I would ask is what we're trying to do is how to make a small and medium enterprise more resilient and able to manage the market that it's given. Now that market will change, and there's a whole important role for public policy to change the support systems in that market and the opportunities in that market. That's not something that we've particularly focused on, but we hope that whatever the changes are, the business will be more resilient in the face of those changes. So we are in the process of going through COVID. We've had 2 years of COVID. It seems clear from the early evidence that businesses with access to business support services were more resilient than ones that weren't. So even from a COVID point of view, it was much better to have outside help than it was not have it, in terms of your likelihood of your business either surviving or even in many cases continuing to grow. But Alice, what does it look like from Rwanda?
Yes, Nicholas. So this time I'll talk with I'll put a different cap on. As a board member of Rwanda Development Board, is a government institution that is here to promote doing business, and that reports directly to the president's office. So basically our mission is to make sure that business in general in the country works, be it local or international investment. And in this context, for a government institution, you're supporting the whole country, you're supporting everybody. So, and aspects like charging becomes a little bit tricky, because people would be like, yeah, you're here to serve us, you're not here to charge us. And the way we approach it is that if there are incentives, you have to first, you put skin in the game. It's not that you get everything. So there is always a contribution from the person who gets this support. And in terms of bigger institutions, we have bigger companies that are real corporate companies, and they get different supports. So there are different packages, different services that the beneficiaries of the services of RDB can benefit from, in a way that everybody can be part of the growth of the country in general. Yes. And yeah, so to find the balance in a way that it remains serving, but at the same time kind of a business approach is always a balance that we have to find. But we believe it's crucial so that whatever we do, it remains sustainable. And for those who are the most vulnerable part of the population, there are other institutions that are there to support. And yeah, so I believe, does that answer your question, Nicholas?
No, that's fine. Lovely. Thanks, Alice. I just noticed another question popped up, which is a really interesting one.
Julia may have a
Julia,
view on the last one.
You have a view on the last one?
Okay.
No, I wouldn't have anything to add really on this one. I think Nicolas gets a very comprehensive and exhaustive overview.
Perhaps I could paraphrase Maxime's question about learnings and iteration, which may not be easy for donors to accommodate. Valuing predictability over agility, which relates to the question I was also going to pop to all of you, which is customizing the service to small businesses is, of course, you know, everyone would agree that that's a good idea, but it is quite expensive, isn't it? It's quite labor intensive, and especially donors tend to be rather sort of short-staffed and short on time. How would you, could you say anything about the interface between funders who are needing something, well, funders that have their needs, and then customizing services on the ground?
Julia, do you want to have a go about the balance between sort of predictability and agility, and the fact that this requires a certain amount of iteration over time, and funders rather like projects usually in a mystical 3 years?
Yeah. So at the Dutch Good Growth Fund, we have the luxury actually of having a mandate that is also built to be like revolving and so self-sustainable. So it was actually a fund mandated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. But the idea is that if we make wise investments and the money come back, we can just keep on investing. So what is beautiful is that it gives us time. So whenever we want to support an entrepreneur support organization, we don't have a set timing. It's about what it is that you want to do. What it is, do you want to start an organization? Do you want to transform an organization? What are your ambitions and how long will it take you? And also how much will it cost? At the beginning, we did a lot of support, like 2 to 3 years. I'll be honest, we validated or not some assumptions, but that's the point where we got. We didn't demonstrate a model. What we have seen is, especially because ODSOs we work for are, you know, to also show how they make the link for the entrepreneurs they support to actual finance offer. It takes about at least 4 to 5 years. So we're happy to say in the long run. On the amount, also how much, you know, it costs, we have a ceiling. Basically, we say, you know, it's whatever you need, but it's basically our top is €500,000. Let me tell you, the majority of the support we have provided over several years is a total amount less than €500,000. And you see the impact. You see a lot of enterprises being supported, and you see them growing in terms of turnover, job creation, but also in terms of being able to attract the local or international financiers that they were not able to attract later. Now, what I would say is we also went through this process. We started with the Dutch Good Growth Fund in 2014. So anything we put there was a lot of a hypothesis. It was coming from our experience before, and we said, okay, these are our hypotheses. But now we are 7 years in, so we had to look back. We had to look at our data and what does that tell us, and how do we adjust? So I think that it's more that you have to have a culture of learning, like an interest, making sure that so what we do here, because of course, yes, we have limited teams and we have limited time, is we just create like small like groups. So we always have like someone from our investment team, someone from my team, that is like the facility, and then someone from the impact team, and together we share. But that's what you need, because all your investment managers are so focused on making the deal, and the impact people are so focused on, you know, getting all the data together to bring the whole story together, understand really what is happening and being able to adapt, you need to have like this mix of experiences and competencies, I think. Does that answer your question?
No, it's very good. And I would just add, when it comes to expense, yes, there are trade-offs between intensity and cost, but we've got programs that are delivering significant changes to enterprises that cost less than $1,000 an enterprise. And when you're consistently generating significantly more revenue than that $1,000 in the community in which that enterprise works, this is a really good deal. So now, if you want, state-of-the-art, large businesses, individual consultancy, yes, that's more expensive. But there are even experiences around doing sort of group coaching, group consulting, peer networking, and also actually encouraging people to do it free. So we have a program in Senegal where basically it's a business network. You could go onto the website and you could ask a question. So an entrepreneur could ask a question of another entrepreneur. I remember sitting in and drinking tea in Senegal with 3 entrepreneurs. 2 of them were exporters. 1 of them wanted to export, and she was learning all about how to export for the first time. And the 2 entrepreneurs who were helping her were revisiting how they've been doing this for the last 15 years and realizing they could do it that much more effectively. All that cost was car journey and a cup of tea and a website. So you can have these kinds of impacts if you organize it in the right way.
I guess
sorry, Jim.
I guess the question was more about transaction costs than absolute amounts. I mean, it's relevant to say, obviously, that the impact is very good for the cost, but transaction cost is also an important thing. And I guess Alice and Julia, you're part of the solution to the problem of high transaction cost, in the sense that you're sitting, I think, in intermediary organizations that take the larger amounts and break them down into smaller amounts for individual personalized support. Let me ask you, Mike Albu says, is it okay to assume that support for small and growing businesses is the key constraint? How do you make sure that you're not a solution looking for a problem, or addressing the problem that isn't the critical problem? There might be another, I mean, I can't think of an example, but I mean, what happens if what you have to offer is not the key constraint?
Well, who's going to try and answer that one? I would say that it's not a key constraint. There are a series of key constraints. So clearly, access to finance is a constraint. Access to non-financial support is a constraint. Access to markets is a constraint. Reliable electricity is a constraint. Ideally, you'd like to obviously work across this whole spectrum. I think the evidence we have suggests that enterprise support services are a cost-effective way of helping businesses grow effectively and to navigate some of these challenges which you wish they didn't have, like, for example, producing with unreliable electricity supply or logistics. Certainly we as a donor can't miraculously make the Kenya grid work effectively, but we can make entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial teams and enterprises more resilient in the face of the challenges that they face, and better able to find solutions. And yes, people need to work across the whole spectrum, but this seems to make a difference.
May I add on that, Nicholas?
Yes, do.
Yes, I do believe it's important for us as service providers to take a bottom-up approach, where we don't come in as the expert and we know everything and we have the solution and this is it, rather than going to the fields, looking at the reality on the ground and listening and adjusting as we go. When we came to Rwanda at the beginning, access to finance was the topic of every meeting and every conversation as being that is the challenge, why entrepreneurship is not working in Rwanda. And so over the years, by talking to the entrepreneurs, by giving them access to finance and seeing that, in fact, it does not match, we realized that the real problem isn't about access to finance. It's just the problem was to give people the opportunity, on one hand, to be listened to, and to allow themselves to be vulnerable, to have someone where they can go and talk about their problems and find solutions, and also business principles. We come from a survival background, and so very often people don't know that it's important to be focused in business. If I do 5 different things, then I'm scattered. And I'm wasting my resources in different ways. I can be focused or reinvest, thinking long-term and all those things. And sometimes we are quite surprised at things that as service providers, we think it's obvious. It's not obvious for everyone. And it can be exactly the barrier that is hindering businesses to grow. So we've learned to listen more than to listen and ask more questions than answers we give. And I do believe that's what can help to avoid providing solutions that no one is really looking for, or that do not have an impact. Yes, thank you.
So Mike's clarified his question to say, how do you select and focus on those economic subsectors in which support is most relevant? I don't know if you want to say anything. Do you do subsector selection or screening?
Well, I think in that case, you can make choices. Broadly speaking, if you wanted the maximal poverty impact, you'd focus on the food sector. And so post-farm gate, but pre-consumer, because that does seem to have the best multiplier effect when it comes to job creation and revenue, incremental revenue. But of course, that sector is also quite transitional in many countries. So it's going through very significant levels of change. So there may be a trade-off between that sector now, but then there are other sectors later. But we do have data on direct and indirect impacts of different sectors, and be very happy to talk about that. But not at 14:59, probably.
Well, just to wrap up, if obviously any of you have any concluding comments, my final question, which you may or may not wish to respond to, is that all of this assumes some values, and you touch on this, helping people to solve their own problems, harnessing the power of entrepreneurship. You know, these are sort of value type choices. And I wondered, I'd be very curious to hear from any of you on, you know, why business support rather than any other thing that one could do in this sphere. What is it that sort of gets you out of bed in the morning on this type of work?
Well, if I may start, it's the people. The people, I'm always impressed by these entrepreneurs' personality and their resilience and this commitment to achieving something. That what motivates me in everything I do. Yes.
Yeah, I was in Kenya a couple of weeks ago, and I would say Evelyn gets me out of bed. So Evelyn, young graduate, designing a smart bin, so that's a bin that actually separates various kinds of rubbish, had already installed her first 3 at a housing complex, being supported by her father to build this business, solving an environmental challenge, building a business, just created her first employment, on this trajectory, being helped by one of our partners. That's what gets you out of bed, really. Julia, what gets you out of bed?
No, same. I mean, you know, if you work in entrepreneurship, I mean, there is so much potential, is so much dynamism. So if you can be the key that enables these people to realize their potential, then you want to be part of that. Yeah.
Well, thank you all. As Nicholas points out, we're coming to the end of our time. So I will thank you, the three of you, for a very inspiring input. Thank you to the participants who came and asked excellent questions. And Ella will kindly write to everyone who registered with a link to the recording and links to the documents and anything else we can think of. So thank you all very much, and I will let us go our separate ways.